The officer thought he had stopped an ordinary driver. Then he looked at the woman in the driver's seat and laughed. "Judge? You expect me to believe that?" She didn't argue. She simply handed him her license and said, "You might want to check the name carefully." He didn't. Instead, he ordered her out of the car and continued mocking her. What he didn't know was that her court security team was already looking for her. And when 3 black SUVs pulled up behind the police cruiser, everything changed. Before we reveal what happened next, subscribe for more powerful stories of justice, dignity, and shocking status reversals. The woman's name was Judge Renee Mitchell. She was 48 years old, calm, professionally dressed, and completely composed despite the flashing lights behind her. She had been driving home after a long day at the courthouse. No chauffeur. No security escort. Just her own car and a quiet road. Then the police lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Renee pulled over immediately. The first officer approached her window. "License and registration." She handed them over. He studied her license. Then looked at her. Then back at the license. "You're a judge." "Yes." The officer smirked. "Sure you are." Renee remained calm. "I don't have anything to prove to you." That answer irritated him. "Step out of the vehicle." Renee slowly opened the door. She could already tell this wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop. The second officer walked over. "What did she do?" The first officer lowered his voice. "She claims she's a judge." Both officers laughed. Renee heard every word. But she didn't react. Instead, she looked down the road. Something was approaching in the distance. 2 black SUVs. Then a third. And every vehicle was moving directly toward the traffic stop. Renee recognized them immediately. Her court security team had arrived. The 3 black SUVs slowed as they approached. The first officer glanced into his side mirror. "What is this?" Renee said nothing. The lead SUV stopped directly behind the police cruiser. 2 uniformed court security officers stepped out. Then 2 more. Their movements were calm, professional, and unmistakably coordinated. The officer who had mocked Renee suddenly stood straighter. One security officer approached. "Judge Mitchell." Renee nodded. "Yes." The officer immediately turned toward the police. "Is there a problem?" The first officer tried to regain control. She was stopped for a traffic violation. The security officer looked at Renee. "Are you okay, Your Honor?" "I am now." Those 3 words changed the atmosphere. The second officer looked confused. "Your Honor." The security team didn't answer him. Instead, they formed a respectful perimeter around Renee. The first officer suddenly realized that the woman he had been mocking wasn't pretending to be a judge. She actually was one. And not just any judge. Renee Mitchell was the presiding judge of the county's criminal court. The officer's face tightened. "I didn't know who she was." Renee looked at him calmly. "That shouldn't matter." He had no response. But the situation was about to become even more uncomfortable. One of the security officers pulled out a phone. "Judge, your chief security officer is on the way." Renee nodded. Then she looked toward the police cruiser. "Officer, may I ask why you stopped me?" The officer hesitated. "Your vehicle matched a description." Renee frowned. "What description?" The officer reached for his radio. But before he could answer, his partner suddenly whispered something in his ear. The officer's expression changed. He looked at Renee, then at the security team, then back at his radio. Apparently, there was something about this traffic stop that hadn't been mentioned. And now everyone wanted to know what it was. The officer lowered his radio slowly. His partner had just told him something that made his face lose all its confidence. The plate was entered incorrectly. Renee heard him. "So this wasn't a match?" The officer avoided her eyes. "We're checking." Renee remained completely still. The court security officers said nothing. They didn't need to. The officer who had mocked her moments earlier now looked nervous. Then his partner spoke again. "There's more." Everyone turned toward him. The original description wasn't for this vehicle. Renee's expression hardened. Then why was I stopped? The officer didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward his cruiser and opened the driver's door. His partner followed. Renee watched them whisper beside the vehicle. One security officer quietly said, "Your Honor, do you want us to document everything?" "Yes." That single word changed the situation. The security team began recording the scene. Now the officers knew this wasn't going to disappear. The first officer returned. "Judge Mitchell, there may have been a communication error." Renee looked directly at him. "A communication error doesn't explain why you mocked my position." The officer went silent. His partner looked uncomfortable. Then the chief court security officer arrived. He stepped out of the third SUV holding a folder. "Your Honor." Renee turned. "What is it?" He opened the folder. Inside was a copy of the original police alert. Renee read the description. Then she looked at the officer. "This isn't my vehicle." "No, ma'am." "And this isn't my license plate." "No, ma'am." Renee slowly closed the folder. "Then why did you refuse to believe me when I told you who I was?" The officer had no answer. But the security chief wasn't finished. He pointed toward the police cruiser. "Judge, there's another problem." Renee looked over. "What?" He lowered his voice. "Your name was mentioned in the dispatch notes before they ever stopped you." The words hit Renee harder than the traffic stop itself. "My name was mentioned?" The security chief nodded. "Before the officers approached your vehicle." Renee looked toward the police cruiser. "So someone knew I was here?" "Apparently." The first officer immediately stepped forward. "That doesn't mean anything. Dispatch handles thousands of calls." Renee shook her head. "Then let's see the record." The officer hesitated. That hesitation told her everything. The chief security officer opened his folder again. "The dispatch log shows your name was entered approximately 7 minutes before the stop." Renee stared at the timestamp. She hadn't called anyone. She hadn't told the courthouse where she was. And nobody should have known she was driving that particular route. Then another detail caught her attention. The note beside her name didn't identify her as a judge. It said, "Confirm identity before contact." Renee's eyes narrowed. Why would someone specifically tell officers to confirm my identity? No one answered. The second officer finally spoke. Maybe it was a routine instruction. Renee looked at him. Then why didn't the first officer verify my identity when I gave him my license? Silence. The first officer looked increasingly uncomfortable. His earlier arrogance was gone. The chief security officer stepped closer to Renee. "Your Honor, we recommend you leave the scene." Renee shook her head. "Not yet." She looked directly at the officer who had mocked her. "I want the full dispatch record." The officer swallowed. "That's not something I can just hand over." "Then contact your supervisor." He reached for his radio. But before he could speak, another message came through. The officer listened. His face went pale. He slowly lowered the radio. Renee immediately noticed. "What did they say?" The officer looked at her. Then at the 3 SUVs. Then back at Renee. "They're sending the precinct commander." Renee's expression remained calm. But the security chief suddenly looked concerned. Because if the precinct commander was being called to a roadside stop, this was no longer a traffic matter. The precinct commander's vehicle arrived less than 10 minutes later. He stepped out quickly, expecting a routine roadside incident. Then he saw Renee. His expression changed immediately. "Judge Mitchell." Renee nodded. "Commander." He walked toward her. "Are you all right?" "I am now. But I have questions." The commander glanced at the officers. "What happened?" The first officer began explaining the traffic stop. But Renee interrupted. "Before you explain, I want you to look at this." She handed him the dispatch record. He read it carefully. His face became serious. Where did this note come from? That's what I'm asking. The commander looked toward his officers. Who authorized this? Neither officer answered. Then the commander noticed something else. The note had been entered using an internal administrative code, not a normal dispatch code. His expression hardened. That's restricted. Renee looked at him. Restricted by whom? The commander didn't answer immediately. The chief security officer stepped forward. Judge, this may require a formal investigation. Renee nodded. It does. The officer who had mocked her finally spoke. Your Honor, I apologize for what I said. Renee looked at him. I accept your apology. He seemed relieved. Then she added, but an apology doesn't explain why my name was placed into a dispatch record before I was stopped. His relief disappeared. The commander requested the officer's body camera footage. Within minutes, the footage was being reviewed. Everyone watched silently. There was the moment Renee handed over her license. There was the moment the officer mocked her. There was the moment she calmly told him she was a judge. And then came the moment that changed everything. The recording captured the officer speaking into his radio before he even approached her vehicle. The commander paused the footage. Play that again. They replayed it. The officer's voice was unmistakable. We've got the judge. Renee stared at the screen. She had never told him she was a judge. The commander slowly turned toward the officer. Then how did you know? The officer couldn't answer. And suddenly, the roadside stop wasn't about a mistaken license plate anymore. It was about who had been watching Judge Renee Mitchell before the police ever pulled her over. The commander stared at the paused footage. The officer's words were clear. We've got the judge. But Renee had never told him she was a judge. The commander turned slowly. Officer, explain that. The officer looked trapped. I heard it from dispatch. Then why does your body camera show you saying it before dispatch contacted you? Silence. Renee folded her arms. Now the entire roadside scene had changed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone had known who she was. Someone had known where she was. And someone had apparently wanted the officers to make contact with her. The commander ordered an immediate review of the dispatch system. Within minutes, the security chief found another entry. A private administrative message had been attached to Renee's name earlier that afternoon. It contained only one instruction. Monitor movement. Renee's expression became serious. Who authorized that? The commander didn't know. But he promised to find out. Renee looked at the officers. You treated me differently because you didn't believe I could be a judge. She paused. But that's not the part that concerns me most. She pointed toward the dispatch record. This does. The commander nodded. We'll investigate it. Renee finally stepped toward her SUV. Her security team opened the door. Before she entered, she turned back. Commander. Yes, Your Honor? Don't investigate this because I'm a judge. She looked at the officers. Investigate it because the next person might not have a security team. The commander nodded firmly. Renee entered her vehicle. The 3 security SUVs followed as she drove away. But inside the police station, the investigation was only beginning. Because when the commander traced the mysterious administrative code, he discovered it wasn't created by a patrol officer. It came from someone much higher. And the name attached to that authorization was one Renee recognized immediately. It belonged to a senior official she had recently ruled against in court. The name on the authorization stopped Renee in her track. She recognized it immediately. It belonged to Victor Hale, a senior county official whose case had been before her courtroom only weeks earlier. Renee had ruled against him, not because of personal feelings, because the evidence demanded it. The commander looked at her carefully. Your Honor, are you certain? Yes. She remembered the case clearly. Hale had been accused of using his position to pressure a witness. Renee had rejected his request for special treatment and ordered the matter to proceed through the proper legal process. Now his name was connected to a secret instruction to monitor her movements. The commander immediately ordered the records secured. But Renee wasn't satisfied. Check every access log. They did. The results were disturbing. Someone had accessed Renee's personal information several times over the previous week. Her vehicle description, her usual courthouse schedule, even an outdated address. The security chief looked at her. Someone was building a profile. Renee's expression remained calm. Then find out why. The investigation moved quickly. They discovered that the traffic stop had been triggered by a false vehicle description. But the description had been deliberately altered, and the person who requested the alteration had used an administrative account connected to Victor Hale's office. The commander immediately contacted the county's Internal Affairs Division. Within hours, investigators arrived. Hale denied everything. I never ordered anyone to follow Judge Mitchell. But investigators had one problem for him. An email. It contained the same administrative code found in the dispatch system. And the email had been sent from Hale's official account. The subject line was only 4 words. Keep her under watch. Renee read the message in silence. Then she looked at the investigators. What happens now? The lead investigator answered carefully. Now we determine how far this goes. Renee nodded. She had spent her career believing the law had to apply equally to everyone. Now she had been given a choice. She could use her position to make this disappear. Or she could let the investigation follow the evidence wherever it led. She chose the second, and when the first investigator opened the complete file, they discovered that Renee wasn't the only person who had been monitored. The file contained a list of other names. Judges, attorneys, witnesses, even ordinary residents who had been involved in cases connected to Victor Hale. Renee stared at the list. This is bigger than me. The investigator nodded. Much bigger. Several people on the list had reported strange traffic stops, unexplained calls, or unexpected visits. Most had assumed the incidents were coincidences. Now investigators were seeing a pattern. Hale's office had allegedly been collecting information about people who challenged his authority. And Renee's traffic stop appeared to be one of the most recent examples. But there was still one question. Why had the officers participated? Investigators reviewed communications between Hale's office and the police department. They discovered several messages requesting extra attention towards certain individuals. The wording was deliberately vague. Nothing directly said to harass anyone. But the pattern was unmistakable. Renee looked at the evidence. Then she said something that surprised everyone. Don't protect me. The investigator looked confused. Your Honor. Don't give me special treatment because I'm the judge who was stopped. She pointed toward the files. Follow the evidence exactly as you would for anyone else. The commander nodded. That is exactly what we'll do. The investigation eventually led to disciplinary proceedings. The officer who had mocked Renee was cleared of involvement in the larger scheme, but his conduct during the stop was formally documented. He later apologized publicly. I judged someone before I knew anything about her, he admitted. Renee accepted the apology. But she made one thing clear. The lesson isn't that you should respect me because I'm a judge. She looked directly at him. The lesson is that you should respect people before you know their title. The investigation into Hale continued separately. And when the final report was released, it confirmed that confidential information had been improperly accessed and used to monitor people connected to his legal dispute. Hale was removed from his position pending further proceedings. Renee never used her authority to punish him personally. She simply allowed the system to follow the evidence. Months later, she drove past the same roadside location where the incident had happened. She slowed for a moment. Then continued. The traffic stop that was supposed to intimidate her had done something completely different. It had exposed a system operating in the shadows. And it reminded everyone watching that sometimes the most powerful response to humiliation isn't anger. It's accountability. Renee had been mocked because an officer didn't believe she could be a judge. Then her court security team arrived. And by the time the investigation ended, the real question wasn't, who is she? It was, who thought they could get away with this?